There's apparently been a series of bombings in Sri Lanka this Easter. The bombs, which now total 8, have been going off across the whole day in different places around the country, most notably in Colombo, where one bomb during an Easter Sunday Mass killed about 50 people so far. And I was looking at some of the pictures of that church beforehand, and it is pretty nasty and shattered. There is wood splinters everywhere from the pews, and all the walls are spattered and tattered, where you can see that all the shrapnel tore through the building. Now, these were not super powerful bombs. These were your typical terrorist type of suicide bombs, which are designed to tear through bodies and flesh, but not really buildings. So it doesn't look like that it did any structural damage. It's not like the church exploded and is going to fall down. But it certainly tore through all those bodies of the people around them, especially if the bomber sat in the middle of the room. And it certainly got the job done, unfortunately. In total, across all 8 bombs, it seems that there have been nearly 200 people killed that we know of, but that toll will probably rise in all likelihood. And we don't even know if this is the last bomb. There could be more bombs. Now, the suicide bombings so far have only targeted churches and sort of nicer high-end hotels. And as a result, nearly 35 of the almost 200 known dead are confirmed to be foreigners. These were people presumably who were staying in these hotels. Saw a picture from the first floor of one of these hotels, and you can tell it's certainly a nice place, but it looked just like the church. It was definitely the same kind of bomb. There wasn't any structural damage, but there was just total evisceration of the furniture and pitting all over the walls. And of course, all the glass windows were shattered. So from the first 5 bombs, I'm not sure about the last 3, but the first 5 bombs, 2 of them were at these nicer hotels, and then 3 of them were at different churches. Now, of course, doing all these bombings on Easter Sunday, and particularly in churches, would suggest some religious motivation here. And of course, Sri Lanka is no stranger to religious violence. As you know, there's been an ongoing war there with I think typically the conflict is between Hindus and Buddhists, but today the police seem to be pretty confident that this is in fact an example of violence by Muslims perpetrated against Christians. Saw a report where some Indian intelligence folks who are apparently going to assist the Sri Lankans were suggesting that this was a pretty clear example of the typical pattern that ISIS follows with their bombings. Apparently in the Indian subcontinent they have a big issue of Muslims going off to the Middle East and training with ISIS for a few months and then being sent back. And so the police apparently suspect that this was an example of some folks who were trained in the Middle East bringing their skills back home and wreaking havoc. Quite interesting to see how the media is treating this story versus how they treat terrorist attacks in Western countries. Even that fire in Notre Dame this past week was covered extensively, even though it was, by all accounts, now an accident, and apparently no one was killed. I mean, the place was empty. And while I certainly think that the fire at Notre Dame is a legitimate news story, it seems strange to me that it should receive so much more coverage than this tragedy in Sri Lanka in which people actually died. I mean, considering the size of the population in Sri Lanka, this attack is probably going to end up being worse than 9/11. And 9/11 is what the U.S. used to justify a more than 20-year-long war now at this point. So you'd think that such an event would be somewhat newsworthy in the West. Although I saw some suggesting that perhaps the media coverage is slanted because this was a Muslim attack on Christians, and after the narrative that they spent so much time building up after the Christchurch shooting, which killed quite a few Muslims, now that they see an attack perpetrated ostensibly, we don't know yet, but the suspicion is that this was perpetrated by Muslims against Christians, that could deflate the narrative, and that's perhaps something the media would like to avoid. But frankly, I think it's a less conscious reason why you don't see these sorts of stories gain a lot of traction in the West and why they don't become widely taught in history books, unlike, say, 9/11. That's simply because people can't relate to a lot of folks in other countries. The news is only presenting news, that's relevant to their viewers, or else people will turn off if they don't care about the news. When people get killed in New Zealand, folks can relate to that. They've met people from New Zealand, and even if they haven't, they've seen them on TV, they understand their accents, and they sound and look and talk a lot like them. The same thing is true of the French. If something bad happens in France, well, we've all met French people, or if not, we've heard them on TV. We understand the French accent. Like we make fun of, oh, I'm going to wear my croissant and wear a beret. It's something that audiences in the West can relate to, people in North America. However, for most folks, I'm sure 95% of people could not find Sri Lanka on a map. They probably couldn't even find Ceylon on a map anymore, which of course was the name of Sri Lanka when it was a British property. Most people probably have never met a Sri Lankan. They've probably never seen one on TV. And frankly, there's so many people over there in the Indian subcontinent that they kind of seem expendable to a lot of people. But hopefully this story will prove me wrong, and the media will cover this as extensively, at least as they covered the Notre Dame fire. Because, God knows, if this occurred in the United States, I'm sure Washington could think of a way to start a new war over it. Hell, if 200 people were killed in a string of serial bombings on Easter Sunday in the United States, I'm certain that the president probably would just declare that we're going to invade Syria right there. Even though invading Syria, wouldn't do much about that, since the militants in Syria are funded by the CIA anyway. Probably be much more effective just to cut off the funding for ISIS if you're so concerned about them, which in fact the president did do to his credit in the last couple of years, and as we've seen since then, ISIS has been pretty quiet. This attack is really the first thing that I've heard about ISIS in months. And who knows, this group may not even be directly connected to ISIS. They may have just been trained by ISIS back in their heyday, and now they've come home to run their own terror group. This bombing, then, could in effect be echoes of the CIA operation to destabilize Syria. It's quite interesting when you look at international affairs from a macro perspective, and you see how actions and events that occur in one country can spiral out of control and not just bleed over into their neighbors, but across the world. It's the same way with 9/11. Propping up Al-Qaeda to try and cause harm to the Soviet Union during the 1980s certainly helped contribute to their strength, which they were able to then exercise on 9/11. It really is quite scary to think how many of these groups that have grown up and become such big problems and have executed such large-scale terror attacks probably would not have gotten off the ground without support from some intelligence agency from across the world. And of course, that doesn't just include the CIA. Whether it be the US, the Soviet Union, China, Pakistan, or North Korea, we've seen that governments prefer to use these proxies to wage their wars rather than getting their own hands dirty. Why invade Syria and overthrow Assad yourself if you can't get congressional approval when you can just as easily fund a terror group which may overthrow Assad for you? It sounds great in theory, but in reality these sorts of strategies do have side effects and unintended consequences, potentially consequences like this serial bombing on Easter Sunday in Sri Lanka. If you folks got anything of value out of this video, I'd appreciate you clicking that like button and subscribing. And if you do end up subscribing, please do remember to click the bell so that you can be reminded each day when I upload a new video. And with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.